Foisamrikwan. The morning sun was just beginning to rise over the sleepy little town. The air smelled fresh, with a hint of dew still lingering on the grass. People were slowly waking up, sipping their coffee, and heading out for the day. Among them was an elderly man who shuffled along the sidewalk, his steps slow but steady. His name wasn't important. What mattered was that he had lived in this town all his life. Everyone knew him as the kind old gentleman who always tipped his hat politely when passing by. He reached the bank, a big, imposing building with shiny glass doors and a sign that read, First National Bank. Inside, it looked even fancier, with its marble floors and rows of teller counters. For decades, this place had been part of his routine. Every month, he'd come here to withdraw money for groceries, bills, and other necessities. It was simple, predictable, and reliable, until today. As he entered, the automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh. The cool air inside felt refreshing, against the warmth outside. He walked up to one of the counters, clutching his worn leather wallet tightly in his hand. It was old, scuffed, and held together with duct tape, but it carried everything he needed: his checkbook, a few faded photos, and memories of a lifetime. A young woman sat behind the counter, typing away furiously on her computer. She barely glanced up as he approached. When she finally did, her expression didn't change much. With practiced efficiency, she asked, "How may I assist you today?" Her voice was polite, but there was something distant about it, like she was reciting lines from a script rather than speaking to another human being. The elderly man carefully pulled out his checkbook and handed it over. "I need to make a withdrawal," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of years. He watched as she flipped through the pages, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. Then, without warning, her face hardened. She shook her head and pushed the checkbook back toward him. "I'm sorry," she said flatly, "but your account doesn't have sufficient funds." His heart sank. "That can't be right," he replied, leaning closer. "I've never missed a payment or overdrafted. There must be some mistake." But instead of looking into the matter further, the young woman simply shrugged and called over the bank manager. Within moments, a sharply dressed man appeared, exuding authority. He took one look at the situation and immediately dismissed the elderly man's concerns. Without giving him a chance to explain, the manager motioned to two burly security guards standing nearby. "Please escort this gentleman out," he instructed, curtly, as if the elderly man were nothing more than an inconvenience. Before he could protest, the guards stepped forward. One grabbed his arm while the other nudged him toward the door. They weren't rough exactly, but they weren't gentle either. The elderly man stumbled slightly, his dignity crumbling under the weight of their actions. Within seconds, he found himself outside, sitting on the cold concrete pavement, staring blankly at the busy street in front of him. For a moment, he couldn't move. His body ached, not just from the fall, but from the sheer humiliation of being treated like a criminal. Tears welled up in his eyes, blurring his vision. Passers-by glanced at him curiously, some pausing briefly before walking away. No one stopped to help. No one cared, or so it seemed. But then, something unexpected happened. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, its engine purring quietly. Out stepped a tall figure wearing a cowboy hat and aviator sunglasses. He moved with purpose, his boots clicking against the pavement as he approached the elderly man. Kneeling, down beside him, he removed his sunglasses and looked directly into the man's eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice calm yet firm. The elderly man blinked, unsure whether to trust this stranger. But there was something reassuring about the way the man carried himself, something familiar. After a long pause, he nodded weakly and began to speak, his words trembling with emotion. They threw me out of the bank, said my account was empty, but I don't understand." The stranger listened intently, his jaw tightening as the story unfolded. When the elderly man finished, the stranger stood up, his expression unreadable. Placing a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder, he said, "Let's go fix this." And with that, he helped the elderly man to his feet, ready to confront the injustice head on. Little did anyone know, this stranger wasn't just any ordinary person. This was someone who believed in standing up for what was right, someone whose presence alone could shake things up. As they turned back toward the bank, whispers began to ripple through the crowd gathering outside. Who was this mysterious man? And why did he care so much about an elderly stranger? What happened next would leave the entire town talking, and remind everyone that sometimes heroes walk among us when we least expect it. This is the first part of the story, written in a natural tone with simple language. Let me know if you'd like me to continue expanding the rest of the parts. The elderly man hesitated for a moment, his hand gripping the stranger's arm as if unsure whether to trust him. The stranger, however, didn't seem bothered by the pause. He stood tall and steady, radiating a quiet confidence that was hard to ignore. "Come on," he said gently, his voice firm but kind. "Let's get this sorted out." With the stranger's help, the elderly man steadied himself and took a deep breath. His legs felt shaky, not just from the fall but from the mix of emotions, swirling inside him, humiliation, confusion, and now a flicker of hope. As they walked back toward the bank's entrance, the automatic doors slid open once again. The cool air greeted them, but this time it carried an uneasy tension. Inside, the atmosphere shifted almost instantly. Customers waiting in line turned their heads, curiosity sparking in their eyes. Some recognized the stranger immediately. Whispers began to ripple through the room like waves. "Is that? Oh my gosh, it is him," one woman murmured to her friend, clutching her purse tighter. Others craned their necks or pulled out their phones, snapping photos discreetly. News traveled fast in small towns, and within moments everyone knew who had just walked in. The bank staff froze. The young teller behind the counter stopped typing mid-sentence, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Even the manager, who had been busy pretending to look important near the water cooler, straightened up abruptly. His confident demeanor faltered when he saw the stranger stride toward him with purpose. For a brief second, his face went pale, and his mouth opened slightly as though he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. "Excuse me," the stranger said, his voice cutting through the low hum of chatter like a knife. It wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to silence the entire room. Everyone turned to watch, holding their breath. The elderly man stood beside him, still leaning on his arm for support, looking both nervous and hopeful. The manager cleared, his throat awkwardly trying to regain his composure. "Sir, how can I assist you today?" he asked, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His tone was overly polite, bordering on desperate. The stranger ignored the question and got straight to the point. "Why did you throw this man out?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with authority. He gestured toward the elderly man whose shoulders tensed at being the center of attention again. "He came here as a customer, a loyal one from what I hear, and you treated him like he was nothing." The manager stammered, clearly caught off guard. Well, sir, there was a misunderstanding. His account showed insufficient funds and we—" "A misunderstanding?" the stranger interrupted, raising an eyebrow. His tone hadn't changed, but there was a sharpness to it now, like a blade barely concealed beneath silk. "You call dumping an elderly man onto the street a misunderstanding?" The manager swallowed hard, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He glanced around the room, searching for support from his staff, but no one dared meet his gaze. The security guards who had escorted the elderly man out earlier shifted uncomfortably where they stood, avoiding eye contact altogether. I assure you, sir, we followed protocol," the manager continued weakly, though his voice wavered. "We can't make exceptions, even for long-term customers." The stranger tilted his head slightly, studying the manager, as if sizing him up. Then, without missing a beat, he leaned forward slightly, his piercing gaze locking onto the manager's. "Protocol?" he repeated slowly, letting the word hang in the air. "You know what I think about protocol? It's just rules written down on paper. But people? People are real. And if your so-called protocol makes you forget that, then maybe it's time to rethink it." A hush fell over the room. No one dared to speak. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The elderly man looked up at the stranger, gratitude shining in his watery eyes. For the first time since being thrown out of the bank, he felt like someone truly cared about what had happened to him. The stranger straightened up and crossed his arms over his chest. "Now," he said, his voice firm, "let's see this account." He turned to the young teller, who had been frozen in place behind the counter. She flinched slightly under his gaze, but quickly nodded and began typing furiously on her computer. As she worked, the stranger kept his focus on the manager, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. Sweat dripped down the side of his face and he tugged at his collar nervously. Whatever confidence he'd shown earlier had evaporated completely. Meanwhile, the crowd of customers continued to whisper among themselves, speculating about what might happen next. After what felt like an eternity, the teller gasped softly and turned her screen toward the stranger. Her hands trembled slightly as she pointed to something on the monitor. The stranger studied it carefully, his expression darkening with each passing second. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, but carried a dangerous edge. "There's definitely something wrong here," he said, glancing at the manager. "And I think it's time we figured out exactly what's going on." The room grew quieter still, anticipation crackling in the air. The elderly man gripped the edge of the counter, his heart pounding. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in hours, he felt a glimmer of justice on the horizon. Whatever it was, he knew one thing for certain. This stranger wasn't going to let things slide, not without a fight. This is part, keeping the tone engaging and human-centric while building suspense. Let me know if you'd like me to continue expanding the... Part 3. The stranger's sharp gaze lingered on the manager, who now looked like a deer caught in headlights. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Every eye in the bank was fixed on the unfolding. Scene, customers, tellers, even the security guards were frozen in place waiting to see what would happen next. "What do you mean?" "Something wrong," the manager finally managed to stammer, his voice cracking under pressure. He tried to sound authoritative, but it came out more like a plea. His hands fidgeted nervously with the edge of his suit jacket, and he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, unable to stand still. The stranger didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned back to the young teller who had gone pale behind the counter. "Show me everything," he said firmly, pointing at her computer screen. "Every transaction, every withdrawal, every deposit. Go back as far as you need to." The teller hesitated for a split second, glancing nervously at the manager. But when the stranger raised an eyebrow and gave her a look that said, "Don't test me," she quickly nodded and started typing again. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up records and documents that filled the screen with lines of numbers and dates. As they scrolled through the account history, the elderly man leaned closer, squinting at the monitor. At first, he didn't understand much of what he was seeing, just rows of figures and technical terms. But then something caught his attention, a series of withdrawals that he didn't recognize. Large amounts, taken out over the past few months. His brow furrowed and he turned to the stranger, his voice trembling. Those aren't mine. I never made those." The stranger nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "I thought so," he muttered under his breath. Turning back to the teller, he asked, "Can you trace where these funds went? Who authorized them?" The teller swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable. She glanced at the manager again, who was now visibly sweating. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "It looks like some of these transactions were flagged internally. They weren't processed by the customer directly." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "It seems someone within the bank initiated them." A murmur rippled through the crowd. People exchanged shocked glances, their whispers growing louder. One woman near the front muttered, "Are you saying someone here is stealing money?" Another man shook his head in disbelief. "That can't be right. This is a bank." The manager, desperate to regain control, stepped forward. "Now hold on just a minute," he exclaimed, his voice rising. "We have strict policies in place to prevent fraud. If there are discrepancies, they'll be investigated thoroughly." "Save it," the stranger interrupted, cutting him off mid-sentence. His tone was icy now, leaving no room for argument. You've already proven you don't care about this man or anyone else standing in your bank. So don't give me that nonsense about policies. What I want to know is who's responsible for this mess. The manager opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came out. His face flushed red and he took a step back, looking like a cornered animal. For the first time, he seemed to realize that this wasn't just another disgruntled customer making a fuss. It was someone who wouldn't back down until the truth came out. Meanwhile, the elderly man stared at the screen in disbelief. His mind raced as he pieced things together. All those times he'd wondered why his balance seemed lower than expected. All those nights spent worrying about how to stretch his savings further. It hadn't been his imagination after all. Someone had been taking advantage of him, and not just him, judging by the murmurs spreading through the crowd. "This isn't fair," the elderly man whispered, his voice breaking. Tears welled up in his eyes as he looked at the stranger. "I worked my whole life to save that money. It's all I have left." The stranger placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I know," he said softly. Then, turning back to the manager, his expression hardened once again. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to call whoever's in charge of auditing accounts and get them down here immediately. And while we wait, you're going to explain exactly how this happened." The manager looked like he wanted to argue, but the stranger's glare silenced him before he could say a word. Reluctantly, he picked up the phone and dialed a number, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the receiver. As he spoke into the phone, his voice cracked with panic and beads of sweat dripped onto the desk. The crowd continued to buzz with excitement and outrage. Some customers began sharing their own suspicions about odd charges or unexplained fees on their accounts. Others pulled out their phones, recording the confrontation as it unfolded. Word spread quickly outside the bank, drawing even more curious onlookers. Within minutes, a local news crew arrived, cameras rolling as they pushed their way inside. One of the reporters approached the stranger, microphone in hand. "Excuse me, sir. Can we ask what's happening here?" she asked eagerly, her camera operator zooming in for a close-up shot. The stranger hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "This gentleman was treated unfairly by this bank," he explained, gesturing toward the elderly man. "And it turns out there might be more to the story than meets the eye. We're getting to the bottom of it right now." The reporter's eyes widened, and she turned to the elderly man. "Is this true, sir? Were you mistreated?" The elderly man nodded, his voice shaky but determined. "Yes," he said simply. "They threw me out without listening to me. And now it seems like someone's been stealing from me too." The crowd erupted into murmurs of disbelief and anger. The reporter turned back to the stranger, clearly sensing she had a big story on her hands. "Sir, may I ask who you are? Are you involved with law enforcement or—" Before she could finish, the stranger cut her off with a small smile. "Just someone who believes in doing the right thing," he said cryptically, tipping his cowboy hat slightly. Then, without another word, he turned his attention back to the manager, who was still frantically trying to stall the auditor's arrival. As the tension mounted, the elderly man felt a strange mix of emotions: fear, relief, and a newfound sense of hope. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for sure. This stranger wasn't going to let anyone walk away scot-free. Justice might take time, but it was coming, and when it did, everyone in that bank would remember this day for years to come. This is part continuing the suspense and human drama while keeping the tone engaging and natural. Let me know if you'd like me to expand further. Part 4. The manager's phone call ended abruptly and he hung up with a shaky sigh. His face was flushed red, his collar damp with sweat. He turned to the stranger, attempting to muster some semblance of authority, but his voice betrayed him. "The auditor is on their way," he announced weakly, avoiding eye contact. "They'll be here soon." The stranger crossed his arms over his chest, his stance unwavering. "Good," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "In the meantime, maybe you can explain how something like this happens in the first place." He gestured toward the computer screen, where the suspicious transactions were still displayed for everyone to see. The manager hesitated, glancing nervously at the crowd that had gathered around them. The customers who had initially come to deposit Checks or withdraw cash now stood transfixed, watching the drama unfold. Some clutched their phones, recording every word. Others whispered among themselves, shaking their heads in disbelief. A few even began recounting their own stories of odd fees or missing funds, fueling the growing tension in the room. I don't know how this happened, the manager finally stammered, his voice trembling. These kinds of things, they're rare. We have strict protocols. Enough with the protocol, the stranger snapped, cutting him off sharply. His patience was wearing thin, and it showed. Protocols don't steal people's money. People do. And someone here made sure these transactions slipped through the cracks. He leaned forward slightly, his piercing gaze locking onto the manager's. So let me ask again, how did this happen? The manager opened his mouth to respond, but closed it just as quickly. For the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed genuinely lost for words. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape route, but there was none. Every exit was blocked, not by physical barriers, but by the weight of accountability pressing down on him. The elderly man, standing quietly beside the stranger, felt a surge of emotions bubbling inside him. Anger, sadness, and relief swirled, together in an overwhelming mix. He clenched his fists tightly, trying to steady himself. This wasn't just about his stolen savings anymore, it was about justice. Justice not only for him, but for anyone else who might have been wronged by the bank. As if sensing the elderly man's turmoil, the stranger placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll get to the bottom of this," he said softly, his voice calm yet firm. Then turning back to the manager, he added, "And if you won't give us answers, maybe someone else will." With that, the stranger motioned to the young teller, who had been standing silently behind the counter, pale and visibly shaken. She flinched when he addressed her directly. "You," he said, pointing at her. "Do you know anything about these transactions? Anything at all?" The teller swallowed hard, her wide eyes darting between the stranger and the manager. She looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded slowly. I've seen similar patterns before," she admitted in a near whisper, her voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. "But I thought it was just normal." "Normal?" the stranger echoed, raising an eyebrow. "What exactly did you think was normal?" She hesitated, clearly torn between fear of retaliation and guilt for staying silent. After a deep breath, she continued. Sometimes certain accounts would show discrepancies, unauthorized withdrawals or transfers, but they'd always get flagged internally. I assumed someone higher up dealt with them. I never questioned it because... Her voice trailed off, and she glanced at the manager, her expression uneasy. "Because you were told not to," the stranger finished for her, his tone softer now. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. He knew all too well how systems could silence those who dared to speak up. Turning back to the manager, he added, "Sounds like your team has been keeping secrets. Secrets that cost honest people their hard-earned money." The manager's face turned an even deeper shade of red. He took a step back, his hands raised defensively. "Look, sir, I assure you I had nothing to do with this," he insisted, his voice rising in desperation. "If there's been misconduct, it's not coming from me." "Oh, really?" the stranger shot back, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Then why are you so eager to cover it up? Why didn't you investigate when this man came to you earlier? Why did you throw him out instead of listening to him?" Each question hit like a hammer blow, leaving the manager speechless. He opened his mouth to respond, but couldn't find the words. Instead, he slumped against the counter, defeated. Just then, the doors swung open, and a middle-aged woman wearing a crisp suit walked in briskly. Her presence commanded attention. She carried a clipboard under one arm and wore a stern expression that suggested she meant business. Behind her trailed two assistants, each carrying stacks of files and laptops. The auditor had arrived. The crowd parted to let her through, and she approached the group with purpose. "I'm Linda," she introduced herself curtly, glancing at the stranger, the manager, and the elderly man in turn. "I understand there's been an issue with an account." The stranger stepped forward, tipping his hat politely. "That's putting it mildly," he replied dryly. "This gentleman," he gestured toward the elderly man, "was accused of having insufficient funds in his account. But it turns out someone within this bank has been siphoning money from his account, and possibly others, for months." Linda's eyebrows shot up, and she immediately turned to the manager. "Is this true?" she demanded, her tone sharp. The manager fumbled for an answer, but before he could say anything, the teller spoke up again, her voice stronger this time. "There are irregularities," she confirmed, nodding toward the computer screen. "Transactions, flagged as internal adjustments but without proper authorization." Linda's expression darkened. Without another word, she instructed her assistants to set up their equipment. Within minutes, they had taken over the counter, pulling up records, cross-referencing data, and digging deeper into the bank's system. The room fell silent except for the clicking of keyboards and the occasional rustle of papers. The elderly man watched anxiously as the investigation unfolded. His heart raced with anticipation. What if they found proof? What if they didn't? Beside him, the stranger remained calm, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos. Outside, the news crew continued filming, capturing every moment of the unfolding scandal. Reporters interviewed bystanders, asking for their thoughts on the situation. Word spread quickly throughout the town, drawing more curious onlookers to the scene. By now, it wasn't just about one elderly man. It was about trust, accountability, and whether justice could truly prevail. As the auditors worked tirelessly, the stranger leaned closer to the elderly man. "Don't worry," he said quietly, his voice full of conviction. "Whatever happens next, we'll make sure you're taken care of. No one messes with people like us and gets away with it." For the first time in hours, the elderly man allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. Whatever came next, he knew he wasn't alone anymore. And with the stranger by his side, the fight for justice was far from over. This is part building suspense while maintaining a natural flow and human-centric focus. Let me know if you'd like to continue expanding. Part 5. The auditors worked quickly, their fingers flying across keyboards as they sifted through lines of data. Papers rustled, printers hummed, and the occasional murmur of discussion broke the tense silence. The elderly man stood nearby, clutching the edge of the counter for support, his eyes glued to the flurry of activity. Every click of a mouse felt like it carried the weight of his entire life, his savings, his dignity, his future. The stranger remained close by, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. He watched the proceedings with quiet intensity, occasionally glancing at the elderly man to offer a reassuring nod. Though he didn't say much, his presence was enough to keep the crowd buzzing with anticipation. People whispered among themselves, speculating about what the auditors might uncover. Some shared stories of their own struggles with banks or companies that had treated them unfairly. Others simply stared in awe at the unfolding drama, unable to look away. Meanwhile, the manager looked like a man on the verge of collapse. He hovered, anxiously near the auditors, wringing his hands and muttering under his breath. Every time one of them asked him a question, he stammered out vague answers, clearly trying to distance himself from any wrongdoing. But no matter how hard he tried, the evidence kept piling up against him and whoever else might be involved. After nearly 30 minutes of intense scrutiny, Linda, the lead auditor, finally turned to face the group. Her clipboard was filled with notes and her lips were pressed into a thin line. "We've found something," she announced, her voice firm but measured. Everyone froze, hanging on her every word. "What did you find?" the stranger asked immediately, stepping forward. His tone was calm but urgent, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Linda hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "It appears there's been systematic manipulation of certain accounts over the past year," she explained. "Unauthorized transfers were made under the guise of internal adjustments. These transactions bypassed standard approval processes, which suggests someone within the bank deliberately exploited the system." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The elderly man's knees buckled slightly and he grabbed the counter even tighter. So, someone stole from me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Linda nodded solemnly. Yes, sir. And not just you. Our preliminary findings show similar patterns in several other accounts. It seems this wasn't an isolated incident. The crowd erupted into murmurs of shock and outrage. Customers began checking their phones, scrolling through banking apps to see if their own accounts showed signs of tampering. One woman near the front exclaimed, "I knew my balance seemed off last month. I thought I was imagining things." Another man shook his head angrily. "This is unbelievable. How could this happen without anyone noticing?" The manager, realizing the gravity of the situation, tried to interject. "Please, let me explain," he started, but Linda cut him off sharply. "You'll have your chance to explain later," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Right now, we need to focus on identifying everyone responsible and ensuring that victims are compensated appropriately." The stranger stepped closer to the elderly man, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "See?" he said quietly, his voice full of quiet confidence. "I told you we'd get to the bottom of this." But the elderly man wasn't ready to celebrate yet. His mind raced with questions. Who had done this? Why had they targeted him? And most importantly, would he ever get his money back? Tears welled up in his eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of humiliation. They were tears of frustration mixed with hope. For so long, he'd felt powerless, invisible even. Now, surrounded by people who cared about uncovering the truth, he began to feel something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of worth. As the auditors continued their work, the news crew outside grew bolder. Reporters pushed their way closer to the entrance, hoping to catch snippets of information. One particularly persistent journalist managed to squeeze past security and approach the stranger directly. "Sir, can you tell us what's happening?" "Here?" she asked, thrusting a microphone toward him. "Who are you, and why are you helping this man?" The stranger tipped his cowboy hat slightly, his aviator sunglasses reflecting the camera lens. "Let's just say I believe in standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves," he replied cryptically. "Sometimes people need a reminder that respect matters more than rules or profits." The reporter pressed further. "Do you think this kind of fraud happens often in banks?" He shrugged nonchalantly, though his expression darkened slightly. "That's not for me to say. But one thing's for sure. If you treat people like numbers instead of human beings, sooner or later, someone's going to call you out on it." His words resonated deeply with the crowd, sparking nods of agreement. Even the bank staff, who had initially tried to defend their institution, looked uneasy. They knew the stranger was right. Somewhere along the way, they'd forgotten why they were there, to serve the community, not exploit it. Back inside, the auditors made another startling discovery. As they dug deeper into the flagged transactions, they noticed a pattern. All the affected accounts belonged to elderly customers or low-income families. It was clear that the perpetrators had targeted the most vulnerable members of the community, people who were less likely to notice discrepancies or raise alarms. When Linda shared this revelation with the group, the elderly man's face twisted with anger and sadness. "They picked on us because they thought we wouldn't fight back," he muttered bitterly, "because they thought we didn't matter." "They were wrong," the stranger said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You matter. All of you matter." He gestured toward the growing crowd of customers, many of whom were now sharing their own stories of financial struggles. "And thanks to you, this won't go unnoticed anymore." By now, the atmosphere in the bank had shifted completely. What had started as a humiliating ordeal for the elderly man had transformed into something far bigger, a reckoning. Justice wasn't just about getting answers. It was about holding people accountable and making sure this never happened again. As before, the auditors wrapped up their initial investigation. Linda turned to the elderly man. "We'll need you to come down to our office tomorrow to finalize everything," she said gently. "In the meantime, rest assured that we're freezing all unauthorized activity and working to recover your funds." The elderly man nodded, relief washing over him. For the first time in days, he felt like he could breathe again. But as he glanced at the stranger beside him, gratitude shining in his eyes, he realized something important. None of this would have happened without him. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting golden light across the street. The crowd lingered, unwilling to leave until they heard the final outcome. Inside, the battle was far from over, but for the first time it felt like victory was within reach. This is Parr, maintaining suspense and emotional depth while keeping the tone engaging and natural. Let me know if you'd like to continue expanding. Part 6. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the town in shades of orange and pink, the mood inside the bank shifted again. The initial shock and outrage began to give way to a sense of determination, a collective resolve to see justice served. The elderly man sat down on one of the waiting chairs near the counter, his legs finally giving out from hours of standing. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to process everything that had happened. Beside him, the stranger remained standing, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the marble floor. The auditors were still hard at work, their faces illuminated by the glow of computer screens as they pieced together the puzzle. Linda, the lead auditor, occasionally glanced up to update the group on her findings. We've identified several employees whose login credentials were used to authorize these transactions, she announced, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. But whether they acted alone or under pressure from higher-ups, that's still unclear. The manager, who had been pacing nervously in the corner, froze mid-step. His face turned pale, and he looked like a man caught in headlights. "I swear I didn't know anything about this," he blurted out, his voice cracking. "If anyone did something wrong, it wasn't me." The stranger shot him a sharp look, his jaw tightening. "Save your excuses," he said coldly. "You might not have pulled the trigger, but you're the one who threw this man out without even listening to him. That makes you part of the problem." The manager opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. Instead, he slumped into a nearby chair, burying his face in his hands. For the first time, he seemed genuinely defeated, not just by the situation, but by the realization that his actions had consequences far beyond what he'd imagined. Meanwhile, the crowd outside continued to grow. People gathered around the news crew, eager to hear updates. Some shared stories of their own struggles with banks or financial institutions, while others expressed disbelief that such blatant theft could happen right under everyone's noses. A young woman holding her toddler whispered to a friend, "It's scary to think someone could take advantage of us like that. What if it happens to us next?" Inside, the elderly man overheard fragments of the conversations drifting through the open doors. It struck him how much bigger this story had become. It wasn't just about him anymore. This was about trust, fairness, and accountability. And somehow he found himself at the center of it all. The stranger noticed the look of overwhelm on the elderly man's face and knelt down beside him. "You okay?" he asked softly, his voice gentle but firm. The elderly man hesitated before nodding slowly. "I'm fine," he replied, though his voice betrayed his exhaustion. "It's just a lot to take in. I never thought something like this would happen to me. I always trusted them." "I know," the stranger said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "And they betrayed that trust. But we're fixing it now. You're not alone." Those simple words meant more to the elderly man than he could put into words. For so long he'd felt invisible, like just another number in a system designed to profit off people like him. But here, surrounded by strangers turned allies, he felt seen, valued, human. As the evening wore on, the auditors uncovered even more damning evidence. Not only had unauthorized transfers been made, but some employees appeared to have falsified records to cover their tracks. One name kept popping up repeatedly, a senior executive who oversaw internal audits and compliance. When Linda mentioned this aloud, the room fell silent. "Wait," the elderly man said suddenly, his voice trembling with anger. "So someone high up, the person supposed to catch fraud, was actually committing it?" Linda nodded grimly. It looks that way. We'll need to dig deeper, but based on what we've found so far, it seems there was collusion at multiple levels. The stranger let out a low whistle, shaking his head in disbelief. Unbelievable, he muttered. Then, turning to the crowd, he raised his voice slightly. This is why systems fail. It's not just bad policies, it's people abusing power. And when that happens, everyone suffers. His words resonated deeply with those present. Heads nodded in agreement and murmurs of support rippled through the room. Even the bank staff, many of whom had initially tried to defend their institution, looked ashamed. They knew the stranger was right. Somewhere along the line, priorities had shifted, from serving customers to maximizing profits no matter the cost. By now, the news cameras were rolling non-stop, capturing every detail of the unfolding scandal. Reporters fired questions at anyone, willing to talk, from customers to bank employees to the auditors themselves. The story was spreading fast, not just locally but nationwide. Social media lit up with hashtags calling for accountability and reform. Messages of solidarity poured in, urging the elderly man and others affected to keep fighting. Finally, after what felt like hours, Linda stepped forward with an update. We've gathered enough evidence to freeze all unauthorized activity and begin recovering funds, she announced. Victims will be contacted individually to discuss compensation. As for those responsible, she paused, her expression hardening. They'll face consequences. A cheer erupted from the crowd, followed by applause. Customers hugged each other, sharing tears of relief and gratitude. The elderly man wiped his eyes, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to smile. But the stranger wasn't done yet. Turning to the manager, who still sat slumped in his chair, he said firmly, "This isn't over for you either. You may not have stolen the money, but you let it happen. You ignored this man when he needed help. That's unacceptable." The manager hung his head, unable to meet the stranger's gaze. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "You'd better," the stranger replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. Then, turning back to the elderly man, he added, "Let's get you home. You've been through enough for one day." As they prepared to leave, the elderly man stopped and turned to the crowd. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice choked with emotion. "All of you. If it weren't for you, and for him," he gestured toward the stranger, "I don't know where I'd be right now." The crowd erupted into applause once again, cheering loudly as the elderly man walked out of the bank, flanked by the stranger. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment for posterity. Outside, the air felt cooler, fresher, a stark contrast to the tension they'd left behind. As they reached the curb, the stranger tipped his cowboy hat slightly and smiled. "You did good today," he said. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone else who's been wronged. This is just the beginning." For the first time in years, the elderly man felt a spark of hope ignite within him. Justice might take time, but it was coming. And thanks to the stranger, he knew he wouldn't have to face it alone. This is part, keeping the emotional stakes high while building toward resolution. Let me know if you'd like to finish with part. The elderly man stood on the sidewalk outside the bank, blinking against the fading sunlight. The cool evening breeze brushed past him, carrying with it the faint scent of freshly cut grass from a nearby park. For the first time in days, he felt like he could breathe freely again. Beside him, the stranger leaned casually against his sleek black car, tipping his cowboy hat slightly as he surveyed the scene. The street was still buzzing with activity. News vans lined the curb, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, while reporters scrambled to get one last soundbite before wrapping up for the night. People lingered too, some holding signs that read, "Justice for Victims," or "Hold Banks Accountable," others simply watching quietly, moved by what they'd witnessed. It wasn't just about the elderly man anymore. It had become a symbol of something bigger, a call for fairness, transparency, and respect. "You okay?" the stranger asked again, his voice soft but steady. He pulled out a handkerchief from his pocket and handed it to the elderly man, who dabbed at his eyes gratefully. "I think so," the elderly man replied, his voice cracking slightly. "It's just, I never expected any of this. One moment I'm being thrown out onto the street, and the next—" His voice trailed off as he gestured toward the crowd. The cameras, the sea of faces turned toward him. "I don't even know how to thank you." The stranger chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "This isn't about me. It's about standing up for what's right. You did most of the work. You trusted us enough to speak up when no one else would listen." The elderly man nodded slowly, absorbing those words. He realized now that courage wasn't about being fearless, it was about pushing through fear because doing nothing felt worse. And today, he'd found that courage, thanks in large part to the stranger beside him. As the commotion around them began to die down, the stranger opened the passenger door of his car. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you home. You've been through a lot, and you deserve some peace." The elderly man hesitated for a moment, then climbed into the car. As they drove away, the town rolled by outside the window. The familiar streets, shops, and parks he'd known his whole life. But everything looked different now, brighter somehow, as if a heavy cloud had lifted. "You know," the elderly man said after a long silence, "I always thought heroes were just in movies. People like you." He glanced at the stranger, a sheepish smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "But here you are, real as can be." The stranger laughed softly, his eyes focused on the road ahead. "I'm not a hero," he said, "just someone who believes in doing the right thing, even if it means stepping into a mess I didn't ask for." "Well, whatever you call it, I owe you more than I can say," the elderly man replied earnestly. "And so does everyone else who's been hurt by that bank." They arrived at his small house a short while later. It was humble but cozy, with flower pots lining the porch and a welcome mat faded from years of use. The elderly man stepped out of the car, turning back to face the stranger. "Will I see you again?" he asked almost hesitantly. The stranger tipped his hat once more, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe," he said with a small smile. "But remember this, justice doesn't come from me or anyone else. It comes from standing together and refusing to stay silent. That's what really matters." With that, he slid back into his car and drove off, leaving the elderly man standing there watching until the taillights disappeared into the distance. Though he didn't know it yet, the stranger's actions had sparked something far greater, a movement. Over the following days, news of the scandal spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with stories of people sharing similar experiences with banks and financial institutions. Hashtags like "Year Stand for Justice" and "No More Fraud" trended nationwide, drawing attention to systemic issues that many had ignored for too long. Local authorities launched investigations into the bank, uncovering layers of corruption that went deeper than anyone imagined. Employees involved in the fraud were arrested, and calls for stricter regulations echoed across the country. In the weeks that followed, the elderly man became a reluctant but inspiring figurehead for change. Community meetings were held to discuss ways to hold corporations accountable. Support groups formed for victims of financial abuse, providing a safe space to share stories and seek advice. Even the young teller from the bank reached out, apologizing for staying silent and vowing to advocate for better practices within her industry. One evening, as the elderly man sat on his porch sipping tea, he reflected on everything that had happened. His savings were slowly being restored, and though the process was far from over, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He realized that while the world could sometimes feel cruel and unfair, it was also full of good people willing to fight for what was right. A neighbor stopped by to drop off a basket of homemade cookies. "We're all rooting for you," she said warmly before heading back home. The elderly man smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the kindness of strangers, but for the reminder that humanity, at its core, was capable of incredible things. Later that night, as he drifted off to sleep, he thought about the stranger in the cowboy hat. Whoever he was, wherever he'd gone, He'd left an indelible mark, not just on the elderly man's life, but on the entire community. Heroes, it seemed, didn't always wear capes. Sometimes they wore boots, sunglasses, and a quiet determination to make the world a little better, one act of courage at a time. This is part bringing closure to the story while leaving room for reflection and inspiration. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments.